Welcome to the What is Stoicism podcast.
Welcome back to the What is Stoicism podcast. This is your host, Alan, speaking. This episode is a welcome return to the podcast for my friend Jon Brooks, creator of the Stoic Handbook, which you can find at stoichandbook.co. Jon and I had a great conversation, and he shared a lot of really valuable insights and practical guidance on the topic of voluntary hardship and what that means in the context of Stoicism. I hope you enjoy the episode and that you find it as useful to reflect on as I did afterward. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Jon Brooks. Jon Brooks, welcome back to the What is Stoicism podcast. It's been around 3 years from checking the last time that we spoke on a podcast. I've been a fan of your work for longer than that probably, but it's great to have you on again. I wonder if you maybe could just reintroduce yourself to the audience or introduce yourself for anyone who doesn't know who you are. Just talk a little bit maybe about what you're working on currently and your interest in Stoicism.
It's really good to be back. It's crazy that it's been 3 years already. I can still remember the last time we spoke. We talked about anxiety, I believe, and it was really fun. And I've interviewed you, you've interviewed me. We've had a really good back and forth, and I'm a big fan as well of what is Stoicism, and often refer people to your site and your podcast and your micro morning meditations as well when I talk to people about where they should go. For me, Stoicism, I kind of turned to Stoicism in a bit of a crisis when I was in my 20s and I was awaiting jaw surgery. And I was really nervous because I was going to have both of my jaws broken to correct an underbite back in my sort of early to mid 20s. And I was like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to think. This is just really stressful. And then I somehow stumbled on Consolations of Philosophy and saw some writings from Seneca. And it just immediately clicked with me. And I was like, whoa, this is crazy. You have very wise, intelligent thinkers, which is what the classic Stoics were, in my estimation, very reasonable. And they are talking about how to live a good life and how to manage emotions. And it wasn't this kind of Pollyanna-ish self-help mumbo-jumbo. It was very grounded and very realistic. And they were dealing with serious things like death and exile and anxiety and all of like status and fame and desire. And it just really, it clicked for me and it appealed to me. And I started kind of just winging it in my 20s and making my own meditations based on what I was like discovering through reading. Because at the time, people don't realize how lucky we are now. We have podcasts and YouTube, and like it's never been easier to learn about Stoicism. The fact that you could just go on ChatGPT and ask like a technical Stoic question now is so cool. 20 years ago, you would have had to have gone into a library and find some obscure book to be able to find out these technical nuances about this philosophy. So I started practicing it and I sort of dabbled with it on and off, always using it just to help me overcome hardship, difficulty, anxiety. I always saw Stoicism as a kind of a remedy, like a therapeutic remedy. And then at a certain point, I think it's got to be back in, I would say 2017, I went on a retreat and I had this insight that I should slow read the Enchiridion by Epictetus and really try to unpack every lesson and break it down and draw diagrams and really try to absorb the wisdom. I just had this insight that would be the thing that would help me. And so I started to do that, and I figured what better way for me to learn about Stoicism, because I'm not an academic, I don't have a PhD in philosophy, than to teach it as I go and kind of show people what I'm learning and what I'm discovering. And that is when I started Substack, stoicism.substack.com. Someone just recommended, Substack's a good platform. So I was like, okay, cool, I can publish there. And then that turned into a podcast very organically. And it was just a passion project of mine, something I just enjoyed learning about and talking about. And it's sort of grown from there. Now there's a website and I create courses. And it's a membership and things. And so yeah, that's kind of how it all started. And as for what I'm working on right now, got a few things on the go. The most recent things I've kind of created have been a 7-day Stoic power challenge, where I kind of it's sort of like I really believe in challenges, because when you have just regular courses, people often drop out. They feel like they can do it at their own pace, but whereas a challenge, it has a clear beginning, middle, and end. And just the act of completing it itself builds discipline, builds temperance, as well as you can practice and you can absorb different insights as you go. So that's something I've recently put out there. And so yeah, I'm just sort of creating podcasts and articles and talking to people like yourself and Don Robertson and other thinkers in the space to continue to learn, to educate, and to kind of build the community within Stoicism.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of alignment between what we each do. And I think I initially found you through your work with the Stoic Handbook, particularly the practical focus you have with creating things like courses and challenges. And one of my favorite pieces of your work was the anxiety audio course. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I really spent a lot of time over the last few years listening to that. I think it was just delivered in the right way, with the right amount of theory, but balanced with practical guidance on how you can use Stoicism to cope with things like anxiety. And as you say in your own story, and as I talk to most people, the same thing sort of comes up, that they find Stoicism when they are going through a hard time and they need something to fall back on. And it just makes sense to them when they first pick it up, and they go from there.
Yeah.
Have you found that too, that, when you speak to people, that most people are using it as a response to, as you say, like a remedy to some hardship they faced?
Yeah, definitely. Like, I think there's sort of two main types of people that I encounter that are drawn to Stoicism. The first type is like just intelligent individuals who believe that there's an alternative way of living better, but they haven't found it yet. Like, maybe they're a bit turned off by pop psychology, and like the cliche advice in the self-help sphere, and then they stumble on the ancient Stoic text, and it's like, oh, this is very special. Like, the Emperor of Rome is showing me how he's thinking and dealing with obstacles. That there's something different about that. You could easily make the argument that Marcus Aurelius' Meditations is the greatest self-improvement book of all time. And it's essentially a person's journal, diary, but yet it still stands the test of time. So there's clearly something special going on there. And then the other type of individual, who I've encountered, is someone who has already achieved a lot, but they have this feeling of what next? Like, what do I do from here? Or I'm already somewhat successful, but I feel like I could be a little bit calmer, or I'm like a manager of a company and I have a lot of responsibility, but I know I'm kind of falling slightly short of my full potential. So Stoicism can be, I have a friend Justin Noppe, who kind of looks at someone's emotional well-being in terms of numbers. So like 0 is baseline. If you're -1, -2, -3, and so on, you're kind of in a deficit state. And then if you're +1, +2, +3, then you're in like a thriving state. But it's completely reasonable for someone to want to go from +2 to +4. That's not unreasonable. But that would be a slightly different approach than someone who's -4 trying to get to 0. Someone who's like -4, maybe they have very different challenges and things to work on to kind of get back up to baseline than someone who's already pretty, has stability and has things that they're succeeding in, but they have these little wrinkles that they want to iron out to get to the next level.
Yeah, that's one of the things I love too, is the flexibility for picking up philosophy. It doesn't demand that you have to be in a certain state to begin with. Anyone can pick it up at any time. We talked about the people who have hardships, and then, it's not a precursor to practicing Stoicism, but it can certainly be a situation that Stoicism can help
Hmm.
with. You mentioned the Enchiridion as well was somewhere you started with, which feels like a good first text for people to read if they're, just getting into things. It's the, very practical piece of work. I think it's basically the highlights of Epictetus's discourses, the most practical parts pulled out of that. Would you still recommend that for people who are just embarking on the source Stoic texts, or have you come across other ones since then that you think that people will be better starting off with?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think uh, my answer to that may be a little bit multifaceted. So I think that the Enchiridion is still up there with one of the greatest philosophy texts ever created, and is still my favorite Stoic book. I think the Enchiridion is a book that you should go to when you want to actually practice Stoicism. It's not really a book to learn about the history of Stoicism and the different thinkers, right? That would be more of a modern Stoicism book, like How to Be a Stoic by Massimo Pigliucci, or The Art of Happiness by Don Robertson, or Stoicism 101 by Eric Cloward. Those would be good, like, oh, what is Stoicism? What's the history? What are the key ideas? How do they see psychology? What are the core techniques? So those are really good books to read for that. But if you just want to upgrade your mental operating system and develop equanimity, resilience, and start thinking more clearly about setbacks, hardships, and all of that stuff, the Enchiridion is really good. If you read it almost like a set of instructions for you to immediately apply. And I think that's the key. You shouldn't just read it like, oh, these are just interesting ideas I'm going to pick up, think about, and then put down. It's a manual. It's actually, he's telling you, install these, I guess you could call them pieces of psychotechnology, Stoic psychotechnology, into your mind, and think like this. So if you break some china on the floor, ask yourself, is this worth your peace of mind? It's not just a bit of wisdom, it's actually a thinking process. And I think there are like 54 sections or chapters in the Enchiridion. So I do think, and I also like the fact that it's not super in depth, because I really like the science of learning. Uh, I practice martial arts, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I'm always asking, how do you learn most effectively? And there's a book called Make It Stick, which is all about the science of learning. And the idea is that if something's a bit difficult to learn, it actually helps you retain it more. So the fact that the Enchiridion, this short book, doesn't tell you everything, the fact that you have to think about it and chew on it and try it out, and it doesn't give you all the answers, that can actually help you develop in your Stoic practice even more than if someone give you too much information. Anytime you have to engage with the material, think about it. There's even references in Make It Stick about, it's the idea of generation, it's called. So if I was to ask you, Alan, to try and figure out a problem, if you tried to figure it out, even if you failed to figure out the problem, when I would then tell you the right answer, that would stick with you longer than if I never told you to try the problem in the first place, to try to figure it out in the first place. Just the act of trying to generate your own answers and engage with the material helps the learning process, even if you're completely wrong. So, if anyone's listening to this, you don't need to go to a book to get all the answers. You can just think about the basics of Stoicism. Ask yourself, what is virtue? What does it mean to live a good life? If I was to design my own cardinal virtues or values, what would they be? And just thinking like that before you even read any Stoic literature will actually help the Stoic philosophy implant itself deeper into your mind, and it will be easier for you to follow.
Yeah, I think that multifaceted approach is really valuable. where you can take time to really let ideas bed in away from the practical and the theory. You can think for yourself for a while, try to interpret what you've learned, and then go back and forth between, the theory and the practical, because you're not necessarily going to agree with everything that you read or practice. Maybe you don't want to take on board every single, piece of theory that you learn about. And that's when it sort of becomes more, you have a lot more agency over the way you're deciding to live your own life. And Stoicism can be a foundation for that, but it doesn't demand this strict adherence to some kind of, code or dogma. So I think that's an appealing part of it too.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
I was just going to say that sometimes people ask me, "Are you a Stoic?" And I kind of just say I don't really like to call myself a Stoic. And I was thinking about Darren Brown says something similar in his book Happy. Have you read that book? Happy? Yeah, it's like I love that book. And instead, I prefer to say I practice Stoicism. I just feel like that's both more accurate and holds me more accountable to my actions, rather than, because you can just say, yeah, I'm a Stoic, and then not actually live according to Stoic philosophy or anything like that. Oh yeah, I'm a Christian, but I don't pray, right? It's kind of doesn't quite make sense. So yeah, just to kind of echo with what you were saying, I like the fact that you can take whatever is useful and discard the rest and engage with it. And I think even the spirit of Stoicism is to question. I think Socrates was known as the kind of the grandfather of Stoicism, the OG. If you want to learn about Stoicism and how to think like a Stoic, you wouldn't go far wrong reading the works of Plato and seeing how Socrates questions things. And if you went up to someone like Socrates and was like, I disagree about this thing to do with Stoicism or this part of your philosophy, he wouldn't tell you to be quiet. He would more than likely be very happy to discuss it. And I think that's very interesting. And it's, the open debate and dialogue is encouraged. And I also really like that about Stoicism too.
Yeah, I think that's an underrated part of Stoicism, is how much influence they actually did draw from Socrates. And just on the point of, calling yourself a Stoic, you just have to look at how many people these days probably do, but then they're promoting some brand of Stoicism that really isn't Stoicism at all. So it's really just a label that they're interested in.
Yeah.
But anyway, the topic that we sort of discussed prior to this that we'd focus on is voluntary hardship and challenge, which is a big part of Stoicism, but it's probably also misunderstood in some areas. So we'll try to tackle that. But first of all, maybe we could sort of frame why we chose this, and in your understanding, what did the Stoics believe was the purpose of deliberately seeking discomfort in what might otherwise be a comfortable life?
Yeah, I think there's multiple benefits to voluntary hardship, rather than just like a single one. The teacher Musonius Rufus noted that people willingly suffer hardships for money and fame and pleasure. And so if that's the case, if people suffer hardships to get more money, to be famous, to have more pleasure, why would we not then also suffer hardships for more noble ends, like developing virtue or excellence of character or tranquility or happiness? And he said that if you exert oneself to discipline one's desires and train oneself to want little, less eagerly than others toil for gold. The idea is that no one can become good without any level of self-control and without any level of effort. And I think you can look at it from a modern psychological perspective. I was hearing Andrew Huberman talk about this part of the brain. You can fact check this, but I think it's the anterior cingulate cortex or something like that. But it's the part of the brain that lights up when you do something that you don't want to do. You make yourself do something that you don't want to do. So in modern terms, that might be going on a diet or going for a run or doing your homework or having a cold shower or reading that difficult book. But when you engage with this and you do something that you don't want to do, that part of your brain grows. And then it gets easier and easier to do those things that you don't want to do, which sounds almost paradoxical, but it's this idea of taking right action. We all can think about using our rational mind. What are the things that I want to be doing with my time, with my life? Most people, they don't picture a future where they are addicted to social media. They're constantly getting irritated and angry with loved ones. They're playing video games. They're glued to YouTube for 7 hours a day. They're eating nothing but donuts. Right? Most people don't imagine that as their best life. And yet, that's actually quite common. That is actually quite common. The environment is pulling us in all these difficult directions. I looked at my niece's screen time the other day, and I saw that she had spent 54 hours on YouTube in a week. And I was like, wow. And it wasn't even like good stuff, it was kind of shorts and just mindless entertainment. I was like, wow, that's probably quite common nowadays. And the question is that actually a good use of time? Is that actually making her get closer to the person that she wants to be, and live the kind of life that she wants? And I would imagine no. So voluntary hardship and challenging yourself and doing difficult things, it strengthens this part of the brain, which then makes it easier to do that. And you just imagine what kind of person you would be if you could rationally decide to do something and then there was a 95% chance that it would get done. A lot of people that I speak to, like coaching clients and so on, they don't even trust themselves. I'll say to them, what are you going to do this week? And they might come up with an action item or a habit. And they don't even think they're going to do it themselves. They're like, I feel like I will, but the past is telling me that I actually won't do this. I don't even trust my own promises to myself. That part of their brain is not developed. You're not really going to be able to be the strongest version of yourself. You're not going to be able to be a person of integrity. You're not going to be able to be a role model. You're not going to be able to be a leader if you can't do what you set out to do. The virtues, the cardinal virtues in Stoicism, they're pretty easy to embody when everything is comfortable. The true power in these virtues is when can you follow them under duress? Can you be courageous when you have every reason to be terrified? Can you be just when you're incentivized to be unjust? And can you do the right thing even when you don't feel like doing it, even when your motivation is low? And then the question is, well, okay, we can understand then that it would be good to be that kind of person who has discipline, who can do the kinds of things that we want to set out to do. So how do we become that person? And the only way to become that kind of person is to do things you don't want to do over and over again and to build that muscle. And that's one of the main, there's other benefits of voluntary hardship, but that's one of the big benefits from my perspective. What would you add to that, Alan?
Sort of framed as, practicing voluntary hardship is preparation for involuntary hardship. So the more you decide to do these things that you don't want to do, the more prepared you are for the unexpected difficulties that you'll face in the future. I suppose that entails, preparing for things that are likely to happen, challenging yourself in ways that are going to serve you best in the future, rather than just mindlessly doing things that are essentially self-punishing or, don't have great value in and of themselves, but maybe are just performative in a way. It's interesting what you say about YouTube there. I've noticed my nephew mindlessly scrolling on YouTube as well, and that's one of the big challenges too, obviously, with voluntary hardship and being able to do things in difficult circumstances, because there's so many distractions. YouTube's basically now like TikTok, where you've got short videos that you can just scroll through infinitely.
Yeah.
And it's easy for a 5-year-old to become completely entranced by that and block out the outside world. So, when I see that, the first thing I try to do is put a stop to it, basically.
Yeah.
And what you said about Andrew Huberman too, I think I actually saw that interview. I'm not sure who he was talking to about it, but I think he mentioned that David Goggins, the area of his brain would be huge, because all he does is challenge himself to things that he doesn't like to do.
Yeah, 100%. So I talked mostly there about the benefits of using voluntary hardship to develop discipline, temperance, a powerful will, the ability to do the right thing even though your emotions are telling you not to. But what you touched on there is this idea of preparing. I think it was Diogenes. Yeah, it was Diogenes the Cynic who said the purpose of philosophy is to be prepared for every fortune, which I think is a beautiful phrase. And if that is the case, then practicing voluntary hardship is a form of preparation for every fortune, for everything that could happen. And Seneca was famous, right? As a lot of us know, for practicing poverty, even though he was extremely wealthy during his time. He said, I got the quote here, "Set aside a certain number of days during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself the while, is this the condition that I feared?" So he's rehearsing poverty, even though he's safe, to try and, I guess, fortify his soul against fortune's violence. So that when the time comes where he may lose the things that he has, he won't flinch. I really like the analogy of shock in cold water. When it comes to preparing for life's misfortune, when people fall into cold water, the thing that will often kill them is the shock rather than the hypothermia. They're not expecting to feel those feelings when they get submerged in ice cold water, and it shocks their nervous system. They can't cope with it. If you can get rid of the shock of misfortune in life, if you get bad news, if you get fired, if you lose something, if you have a breakup, if you get ill, if you can somehow train yourself to not flinch when that happens, it doesn't mean that it's going to be all fine and enjoyable and it's not going to be difficult. It will be, but you'll be able to deal with it so much better if you saw it coming. Like if I said to you in, February the 5th, 2026, your website and your podcast is going to crash for 3 weeks. I'm just going to prepare you in advance. And it's a certainty. That now is going to be a very different 3 weeks because you see it coming than if it just happened on the day and you didn't. A very, very different 3 weeks. And the only difference there is that you prepared for it. And in the second scenario, you didn't.
Yeah, it's like an inoculation against future misfortune. You mentioned Seneca there. That's a quote I'd taken note of as well. One thing I thought of with that was how does Seneca's recommendation of sort of poverty days, how does that differ from asceticism, which is probably more what Diogenes practiced, but which the Stoics actually criticized?
Yeah, you want my own view on that, or?
Yeah, um, yeah. From your understanding, what would you say would be the difference between something more akin to asceticism as opposed to actually practicing eating, simple food and wearing simple clothing for a period of time?
My first thought is that what Seneca is doing there is that he's doing a dose of asceticism, but isn't making that philosophy his core philosophy of life. So you could see it like, is it good to be a hedonist and to live for pleasure all the time? No, probably not. But what if we all decided to spend one day a year being a hedonist? You could make the case that that would actually be good. That could help us. That could help us, with ecstatic experiences and with bonding and celebrations and community. So that would be a small dose of hedonism, but it's not the dominating philosophy of your life. So I think Seneca there is doing a small dose of asceticism, which I think is good. And I think there are parts of asceticism that are really powerful and useful. And I think even the Stoics and Socrates would agree with that. There are elements of it that are great. Like it's a form of ascesis is a form of training. Yeah, and the cynics believe that hardship is a shortcut to virtue. But the Stoics were like, yeah, it's a bit too much. It's a bit too self-punitive. It's too harsh. There's no middle way. There's no balance there. Similar to the Buddhist middle way, actually, because Buddha himself in his journey was kind of an ascetic, fasting to the point of almost dying, and then finding the middle way. It's almost like Zeno had a similar journey in a similar kind of time, which is kind of interesting. Of training with the cynics, them only eat when you're hungry, only drink when you're thirsty, shun all luxury, all possessions, be completely free, renounce everything. This is how you truly become free. And then at a certain point, Zeno was like, no, I don't quite fully buy that. But that doesn't mean that there weren't good things in that school of thought. So yeah, I see Seneca as taking some of that and practicing it, using it, but not letting it become his sole philosophy of life.
Yeah, I think framing it as a dose of asceticism is a great way of putting it. And Seneca actually had a quote of comparing philosophy to medicine. I think he said a draft of philosophy is bitter, but also nourishing, just like medicine, something along those lines. So Seneca was wealthy, as we know, and yet still practiced this voluntary poverty. A lot of people probably criticize that or see it as hypocrisy, in that he had the freedom to be able to do that while then going back to his comfortable lifestyle. Would you see that as, is there any hypocrisy in that in your opinion, or is it even more wise to be able to do that, to step away from the riches for a while, not being, I suppose, tied to the riches is what Seneca would say to defend it. He has the freedom to not let them rule him, is probably what he would say. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's, first of all, I would say it's always tricky casting judgment on people that lived in a very different time period from ourselves, because we unconsciously just imagine Seneca kind of being in the modern world practicing poverty. But we can watch a lot of period pieces on Netflix, but we really have no idea what it was like to live in those times. So whenever we cast judgment on an individual from that far back, who's not in the same culture, not speaking the same language, it's a completely different time period. Like my partner a few weeks ago, just to put this in perspective, had to have antibiotics. So nothing major, but had to have antibiotics. So I looked up, would this mild infection have killed her, 500 years ago? And the answer is probably yes. Probably yes. Either you would have to live with an infection that would not go, or you would probably die. And antibiotics came about in the 1940s. So any infection, if you've ever been on antibiotics, any infection pre-1940s might have killed you. So we've all dodged death multiple times. Just the fact of that alone, now when you go and watch a period piece from 200 years ago and they're getting into a fight, or they're taking risks. They're taking risks in a world where there's no modern medicine, no antibiotics. It's just a very different world that we're in. That is a bit of a side tangent, but I did find that interesting, and it does put things in perspective when you compare modern life to then. As for Seneca being a hypocrite, I think he would have thought to himself, what am I overly attached to right now? I'm a multi-millionaire or billionaire. I know that I'm living a comfortable life. I know that I have pretty much everything I could want. And I know that I'm probably a bit attached to that. So I want to be okay mentally to be able to let go of it if I needed to. So how am I going to practice that? I'm going to practice it by practicing poverty. If you are someone who is living in poverty, obviously that wouldn't be the thing that you would practice. You would choose something else to work on. You'd think about what actually am I afraid of losing right now? Or what am I too attached to? And then you'd practice with whatever that is. So yeah, that's my view on that. What would you say? Do you see it as like a hypocrisy or pragmatism?
Well, yeah, I think even though Seneca was very wealthy in that time, he didn't necessarily live an easy life. He faced exile, I think multiple times possibly. I think an infant son died. Obviously he had to tutor the Emperor Nero, which he couldn't get away from even when he wanted to, when Nero had turned into a kind of crazy emperor, bloodthirsty psychopath, basically, from what we can understand. Seneca wanted out of that environment, but basically Nero wouldn't let him, I think, is what happened. And then ultimately he was forced to take his own life by Nero, so he wasn't plain sailing in that way. And I guess if he did practice certain voluntary hardships, then perhaps that was wise in view of what he had to face later. Now, we don't know that he exactly practiced for those things, but given how experienced he was in Stoicism, it's probably safe to assume that he did try to vary the things that he prepared for.
Yeah. I completely agree with your perspective. That's always really important to keep in mind when it's tempting to kind of simplify a human being into, Seneca, a very wealthy philosopher from ancient times, not realizing that he had a son who died when his son was 5, or that he had this extreme illness, maybe tuberculosis, that was, he called it practicing death, maybe he had an infection that antibiotics couldn't cure. You mentioned Nero there as well. I think listeners will find this interesting. So I want to share some facts about Emperor Nero, because he's well worth looking into. I have an article on the Stoic Handbook about Nero. So I'll give you a couple of facts. So these are interesting to me. So in the Olympics, AD 67, Nero won every event in the Olympics, in his own Olympics, which is just amazing. He faked multiple assassination attempts so that he could kind of create this narrative that he has enemies that need to be killed themselves. So imagine that, like you just decide that you pretend in an elaborate act that someone's tried assassinating you just so that you can go on the attack. Even though he was the emperor, he spent so much money that he debased Roman currency, and it contributed to inflation across the empire. He was an actor. He performed in a play, and a real earthquake struck when he was playing. And he continued with his role, even though the earthquake was happening, which is kind of bizarre. I guess I think everyone was running around him, but he kept going. Yeah, and he died when he was 30 years old. Yeah, he was a complete like psycho, like as bad as you can get. If you watch Game of Thrones, I think some of the worst characters on that are based on Emperor Nero, and he killed his own mother as well. He orchestrated her murder. Absolutely crazy. So yeah, there's an article, you might want to share the link to that I can give you about the psychopathy of Emperor Nero.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great facts, particularly the Olympics one.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a great book by Emily Wilson, actually. It's called The Greatest Empire, which is a great account of Seneca's lifetime and a lot of the background and the time he spent with Nero and things like that. I would really recommend that.
You're a big reader, right? Are you still reading quite a lot now?
Yeah.
Anything like that you've been impressed with? I'll add The Greatest Empire to the list. Anything else that you've been enjoying?
I away from philosophy, but in a way still fairly philosophical. The novels of Kurt Vonnegut.
Mm-hmm.
I've read, I think, 12 of 14 that he wrote.
Wow.
And they're just fantastic.
Kurt Vonnegut. Yeah. Never read one of his books.
He's good. Yeah, highly recommend. Just his style of writing, as well as his humanity and humor as well. And he gives great speeches too, if you ever look those up on YouTube. Just a great character.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I like these little Easter eggs that you can find, even though it's not necessarily Stoic or philosophy related. That doesn't mean that it wouldn't really click with the types of people that are interested in Stoicism, and we can still learn from it.
Yeah, exactly. I often find a lot of things that I can draw upon within my writing about Stoicism, in these novels that are seemingly not related to philosophy, but in the end, they're all based around human lives, and that's common to philosophy. That's common to anyone who's reading it. Yeah. So there's always some lesson to be found. And I started reading the essays of Montaigne as well, which is more related to Stoicism because he was highly influenced by the Stoics. That's a very long book, so it's one to just dip in and out of now and again.
Yeah, I've coincidentally started dipping into that too. Yeah, that's a book that's talked a lot about by Alain de Botton, one of his favorite books. It's like a book that you can keep reading and rereading, and apparently there's nothing out there quite like it. The level of authenticity that he puts into the pages, you feel like even though he's writing about ideas, it's almost like a autobiography as well. Like you feel like you get to know him very personally, even though he's not necessarily divulging loads of facts about his own life. You just kind of get to know him through his views and his thinking, and so yeah, that is something.
Yeah, it really comes across that way. It's kind of right inside his mind, and I think it was basically a pioneering style of writing at the time. No one else had really written essays as such, but he basically created that kind of genre.
Yeah.
Is there any books you've been reading recently that you would recommend?
When it comes to Stoicism, I have read Stoicism 101 by Eric Cloward, who is the creator of Stoic Coffee Break. I think that's a fantastic introduction to Stoicism. It's really simple and well written. Um, Don Robertson's book, How to Think Like Socrates. That's like a really insightful book full of wisdom. I know that you've read that too, right, Alan? I think
Yeah. Yeah.
you did a podcast with Donald on that. I think that's just really interesting book, and it's a great remedy for like the self-improvement movement. It's a book ultimately about trying to think for yourself instead of just taking prescriptions that other people have given you. That's the skill of Socrates. That's his legacy. Question all things. Think for yourself. Exercise the mind. But yeah, I'm similar to you. I kind of read. I kind of read. I tend to think about what problem am I facing right now, and then I try to think, what book do I want to read on that subject? So I read a lot of parenting books. There's a book that I'm reading. Let me just find it now. It is by Philippa Perry. I think it's called The Book You Wish Your Parents Read. It's called The Book You Wish Your Parents Read. So it's kind of like she's a psychotherapist and she's kind of teaching you all the things about your own upbringing and all the things that probably weren't ideal and how you can break the cycle and not pass that on to your own children. So that's a book that I'm reading, and I like to read kind of random books. So another book I'm reading is the chef Gordon Ramsay's autobiography, because I think that he's got a very good work ethic. So if I see someone I think has an element of their personality that is admirable, and then I might go and read their autobiography to figure out what makes this person tick. And Gordon Ramsay, the most successful chef, in the world, multiple 3 Michelin star restaurants, massive level of success, huge number of TV shows that he's created in his life. He's an Ironman ultra-marathon runner in his spare time. It's like a crazy level of work ethic. And so I was like, I want to learn more about that. And then, of course, you start reading and you realize that he came from an abusive household and his dad was extremely violent and a bully. And then you start to, see that not is all as it seems. And that's often the case when you read biographies, that often great people are driven by some level of trauma and pain. So
Yeah, that's interesting. It's always good to get insight in the background on how people got to where they were, and I think it gives you a bit more of a compassion for most people too when you read about what they've came from. I don't know if have you seen the documentary Young Plato?
not
Any
yet.
chance?
No, it's on my list.
Yeah, that's a good one. I'd recommend that.
Young Plato.
It's basically a school in Belfast where the headmaster's introducing philosophy to the students and using it as a way to resolve conflicts and make the students reflect on the things they do. So yeah, really
Young
recommend
Plato.
that.
Sounds good. I had heard about it, but yeah, you've just given me the push to watch it very soon.
Cool. Coming back to voluntary hardship and challenge, another figurehead for that would be Cato the Younger. He's probably talked about a lot in relation to this. He deliberately wore coarse garments and tried to invite ridicule, basically, feigning himself to be indifferent to the opinions of other people. This is a kind of different kind of hardship, really, to what we were thinking about before. It's kind of a social hardship. What do you think that reveals about Stoic priorities in terms of the things that they want to be free from?
Yeah, so I think about this kind of thing a lot. I practice Stoicism, right? You practice Stoicism. We like to read about it and talk about it and engage with other people that practice Stoicism. But the question is, if you were put into a court and you faced execution, and you could get away from that execution if you lied or you didn't kind of honor your own values, would you do it? Would you be okay dying now, like tomorrow, in order to be in integrity with your values and your beliefs? I think that's a really interesting thought experiment. It kind of puts a lot of pressure on us, right? And I wouldn't judge anyone either way. I think that I like to practice flexibility in my thinking and looking at both sides of the coin, and looking there's pros and cons to both. But someone who's really entrenched with this idea of being free, they may have this belief that if someone external to them can make them disavow their own cherished values or beliefs, then they are then a slave to that person or that individual or that society. So that can get very interesting, because the Stoics, Epictetus has a line about this. It's like, right, you can put me in chains, but you can't chain my will or my soul. You can even kill me, but you can't take away my freedom. It's like there's almost like a paradox there. I'm paraphrasing Epictetus, but it's this idea that, yeah, you can physically do stuff to my body, but you will never be able to harm my mind, my philosophy, my ability to do the right thing, to think the right thing. So if you're really, really living according to that worldview, then as you go through life, and maybe Cato the Younger was a bit like this, he would not allow himself to be a slave to other people, a slave to externals. And there could be a shadow side to that, where you become a bit reckless and almost like you lose respect for your own body and safety. And you become brazen almost. But there's also something really epic and heroic about it. And Cato the Younger was a Stoic hero for that reason, and he did exemplify toughness in adversity. He led his outnumbered forces through deserts. He marched the shattered remnants of the Republican army through the African sands, and he refused to submit even in defeat. I have some notes on Cato. The Stoics called him the invincible Cato because of his unbreakable will. And so a lot of us think of someone as being invincible as someone who can't die, whereas someone like Cato or the ancient Stoics may think, actually, no, an invincible person is a person who has an invincible will, not an invincible body. So it's a really interesting way to think about it, though. I don't know if that answers the kind of question, but those are some thoughts I have on that.
Yeah, he's a very interesting character, and I think he must have had other ways of training himself too, because, as you say, he was a military leader, and the great story about him too is that when he didn't see himself as above his troops, he walked alongside them, and when they came across a water source, he was always the last to drink. He was able to put himself through all different types of hardship, really, mental, physical, social, whatever it was. So it's no wonder that he's seen as a kind of a Stoic hero, and incorruptible too, in a time that was rife with corruption. The thought experiment you mentioned too, I suppose that's probably, you might call that the Socrates question, because basically that's what he did.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what he did.
For anyone who hasn't read the Apology, I would recommend reading that too. I think I recently saw Donald Robertson say that's the one philosophy book you should read if you had to pick one. So yeah, great lessons in that one.
Yeah, Donald Robertson actually says that that's the one book, not just philosophy book, but the one book he thinks everyone should read on planet Earth, period. So that's quite a big sell for me. That's why you should read that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Plato's Apology, for anyone who wants to read that. Definitely recommend it. What would you say would be the modern equivalent of some of the training that Cato was doing? You know, walking through the forum in rough clothing, or where might we invite ridicule ourselves or push against conformity in a way that I suppose is manageable, you know, without doing something daft, essentially,
Doing something daft. Yeah.
that could invite, you know, consequences that we don't need.
It's again, this is a really interesting kind of topic, because you can have two levels to this. You can have a general level of training and voluntary hardship, and then you can have a customized level. And I think the general level are the basic things. Like, what do human beings in general find difficult that are also pretty good for you? Well, exercise, you know, going for a long run and you just feel too hot and your heart is beating too quick. You know that it's good for you, but it's also difficult. So that's a good, you know, it's a good thing to practice. Endurance training. That's what David Goggins does a lot of. It could be something like martial arts, you know, like having your ego handed to you when you, in my case, jujitsu, and you're exhausted and someone is pinning you and you thought you were really good at this sport and now you feel like you're terrible and you're getting manhandled. And it puts, you know, it kind of gets rid of this illusion that you're something special. You just realize you're just a human. And that's a form of voluntary hardship, but it's also kind of nourishing as well, because you come away feeling lighter and feeling happier because of the exercise and feeling like there's room to improve and I can get better at this thing. Things like cold exposure, even things like mindfulness meditation. If you're someone who's very restless, I've heard many people say this. I'm not really a sit still kind of person, so I don't meditate. And my immediate thought is that's why you should meditate. You know, if you're a restless person, that's why you meditate. You don't then do a running meditation. You know, the point of meditation is it can be used as a form of voluntary hardship. You have to sit still. You have to get through the procrastination. You have to get through the boredom. You have to get through the restlessness and just sit with your feelings. It's not just about the kind of Buddhist insights that you gain. It's the practice elements are a form of voluntary hardship too. And then you have the custom voluntary hardship elements. Now and again, you meet individuals who are just not built like normal people. The things that make you uncomfortable don't make them uncomfortable. When I was living in Amsterdam, I was doing sort of, as a practice of voluntary hardship, I was practicing talking to people socially, you know, talking to strangers and sort of getting outside of my comfort zone, being more social, very like friendly and polite, but, you know, practicing getting out of my introverted social comfort zone. But there were some individuals who would do any kind of social challenge. They didn't think twice. And then I realized that is their comfort zone. Their comfort zone is to be a bit crazy, to be a bit wild, and to be the center of attention. Maybe that person's comfort zone is to be, maybe that person's voluntary hardship is to be quieter. The person who talks a lot and holds attention in a group, we initially think, oh, wow, that person, you know, they're so confident. But maybe they're only confident when they're playing that persona. Maybe if you say to that person, now in the next interaction you have, you need to listen more than you talk. You need to ask questions. You need to be interested. Suddenly then they're going to struggle. One of my clients loves to talk and he likes to interrupt. And it's, you know, we both know it. But part of his training, part of, you know, him doing voluntary hardship and building his character is to do exactly that, to not interrupt and to be curious and to be interested. For people like you and I, Alan, that's easy, right? That's our comfort zone. We can ask people questions. We can be, you know, a bit more relaxed and let other people talk. And because we are curious people, you know, I don't know exactly if this is true for you, but I would guess that you are not the type of person that wants to be the center of attention in big groups all of the time. And so for people, I guess maybe,
Yeah,
what's
that's
that? Yeah.
correct. That's
Yeah. So,
correct.
so maybe for people like us, that is then an area that we could grow in. So that's the customized comfort zone that we can work on. So to circle back to your question, how can we practice this? How can we train in this? I think having the basics dialed in, right? Like, are you generally doing something difficult? You know, it could be playing sport. I think you played football last time we spoke. That,
Yeah.
something like that is amazing. It's difficult, it's challenging. It doesn't mean that it has to be unpleasant, but you can enjoy the challenge too. Martial arts, some kind of exercise, something that challenges your mind or body. That's like the basic level. But then the next level then is asking yourself, what do I resist? What am I afraid of? If you think of your entire life like a map, all of your actions, decisions, thoughts, feelings, personal attributes, where in my life am I kind of avoiding things? Am I shying away from things? Those point to the areas that you can practice voluntary hardship in and challenge yourself in. So I think, yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I would say to that.
So that perfectly kind of leads into, you mentioned a few things there. I play football, more introverted in nature, and I don't like being the center of groups and things like
Yeah.
that. But I played football for over 20 years for the same football team, and eventually that kind of comes to an end that you can't play to the same level anymore. So over the last sort of year or so, I've tried to move more into the coaching side. And playing, you only have to concentrate on playing. You don't have to worry about training, who's setting up the training drills or how many footballs there are or where the equipment is, explaining things to people. You literally turn up and play. Seeing it from the coaching side, which is something I never actually thought I would do, simply because there's a lot more social element to it. You have to speak with authority. You have to explain things clearly. You have to have times when you're standing there and there are 20 people staring at you, confused because they don't know what they're supposed to be doing in a certain exercise, and you have to go through it step by step and re-explain it. And that's probably my example of voluntary hardship, but also in a way involuntary hardship, because I didn't necessarily wanted it in the beginning, but the club needed coaches and I gave it a go. And the more I did it then, which is what we kind of are touching on here, it's not easy. It's still not easy for me, but it's become easier than it was. And even just doing it, I've kind of surprised myself that I've been able to do it. So, yeah, that's my kind of personal story for that. I don't know if you have anything recent or, a personal story that you'd like to share other than, sort of your jiu-jitsu
Yeah.
and, and things like that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say that that is an amazing story. And you said that it might be involuntary hardship. I would say it definitely is voluntary hardship because you have the power to not do that. No one is literally making you do it. You have the power to walk
Yeah.
away. So it is still voluntary hardship. And yeah, that's like just a really good story. And I can see, even though it's difficult initially to get going, I think you will have attributes as a coach and a teacher that people that find it easy don't have. And that's kind of one of the cool elements of this, is that when you develop in discipline or you push yourself into areas that are not comfortable, you could surprise yourself and see that actually you can do things better than the people that find it easy. And it's a bit sad actually that there are really talented people that could be world class at things, but just because their emotions are telling them, "Oh, don't do this," they never get the opportunity to master it or to learn it or to grow in it. So yeah, that's really cool. As for personal stories, about, yeah, I think being a parent in general, just being thrown into the world of parenting, every day you have to lead and set boundaries and be a sturdy leader for the kids and deal with challenges and crises and all sorts of things. So I'm always outside of my comfort zone in a way. And then the other thing as well about children is that they're growing. So you think you've figured out parenting a 3-year-old. Next thing you know, your child is 7, and it's a different thing. And then they're 10, and then they're 12, and I'm not there yet, but parenting a 15-year-old is obviously going to be very different from parenting a 1-year-old. It may as well be 2 different jobs, right? 2 very different jobs. And that's the journey that you're on as a parent. And you don't have to be a parent. A coach is similar. Whether you just working with younger people like your nephews or nieces or that kind of thing, being a teacher of any kind, you get to experience that. So yeah, that's one thing that I'm kind of stretched in fairly regularly. There was something that happened recently, like within the last month, where I was experiencing a co-parenting challenge, and I had to go to a meeting at the school, and there were some individuals at the school that I didn't think were doing their job very well and weren't following their own policies. And so I did a lot of research on this, and I tried to figure out more about their own job than they knew about their jobs. And I went to the meeting with extensive notes, pages of notes, and I didn't feel good. It was very difficult. I felt tense. I felt outside of my comfort zone. But I also thought, like, so what? I guess this is, I'm just because I'm outside of my comfort zone, or this is difficult, it doesn't, I can still go and do the thing. And I sat there in a meeting with a bunch of people, and I said, this is the research that I've done. This is what I want. This is what I think needs to be different. And I essentially told them how to do their jobs well, even though a week earlier I didn't know anything about this world myself. So that was a good experience to be able to do that. So yeah, that's like a recent example of something on my end.
Yeah, it's a really good example. It really makes me think of sort of the interconnection of virtue there. You had the courage to do it, discipline to prepare for it, the wisdom to know it was the right thing, and obviously justice to treat people fairly and try to do the best for your son too.
Good way to put it. I didn't think of that.
Which is great.
I didn't think of the virtues mapping onto it, but yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, that's a kind of a big insight for me in the last while in terms of learning about Stoicism, and that the virtues generally always have to be interconnected to be truly virtuous. Do you see it that way in terms of voluntary hardship? Does it touch on all the virtues, or do you think it's really only about self-control and discipline? Or if someone only does focus on those elements, what would they be missing?
Yeah, I like your insights about the virtues being interconnected. I think it's a really deep insight, and it's not something that's obvious when you first learn about these things. I think that I believe that they are all interconnected, but I also, at least from my experience, think that discipline or the ability to take right action is kind of like fundamental, extra fundamental almost. Because if you can't trust yourself, like if you have no track record of doing the things you say you're going to do, things are going to be very difficult then when the time comes to be courageous, or the time comes to do the right thing and be just and fair. I do agree with the cynics that you learn a lot about yourself when you set your mind to doing something. If you give yourself a 30-day challenge, or I'm going to meditate every day for 30 days, you're going to learn how your mind tricks you. You're going to learn how you tell yourself stories to not do the thing, how you procrastinate, how you have these other sub-personalities that lead you astray. And it can give you these insights and, the idea of know thyself, nothing in excess. Some people have said that is Stoicism in a sentence. But to me, that sounds a lot like discipline. When you practice voluntary hardship, you get to know yourself and how your mind works pretty clearly. And you also develop the art of nothing in excess. You develop that. Someone very high in compassion, just like a really nice person. Let's just say they have not much of a fear instinct. Nothing really makes them afraid, right? So they got not much need for courage. They're just really kind to everyone that comes by. But their mind is scattered and they can't do what they set their mind to doing. Then what's the point in being courageous and being kind? There's still going to be a lot of chaos. So yeah, I think wisdom is the kind of unifying virtue as well, like knowing what's too much, what's too little. Wisdom is the kind of watcher of the virtues and how it works. But yeah, I do think that discipline is somehow fundamental to a lot of things in Stoicism.
Yeah, I agree. It's hard to say really which one underpins the rest, because a case could be made for all of them really. So yeah. I think just accepting that they're all interconnected is sufficient. We sort of touched on this earlier, the kind of distractions in modern life, I suppose you might call it the softness of modern life. Do you think our abundance and comfort today makes Stoic voluntary hardship practices more relevant? Or, I'm sure you probably don't agree with this, but some might say it makes it less relevant because there's less need to challenge yourself in those ways. But I think, as you also said earlier, if you're not challenging yourself in those ways, you can't hope to be the best version of yourself. I suppose I'm sure all different ages, times in history, have faced other distractions and excuses not to, to practice voluntary hardship. But it seems today it's more difficult than ever. But would you say it's that makes it more relevant, more valuable?
Yeah, I think that we are experiencing like a meaning crisis, at least in certain parts of the world, where life is pretty comfortable. And now we're faced, if you remember at the beginning of this talk, I said there are two types of people drawn to Stoicism. The first type are people that are suffering a lot. And then the second type are people that have this feeling of like, what now? Like, I don't need anything, but what now? Like, I still feel a bit lost. I still feel like there's no guiding principle or purpose. There are, without a shadow of a doubt, many multimillionaires that feel purposeless in the world right now. And they've worked super hard on their business or some project, made a lot of money. And then they're like, oh, I don't know what to do with the second half of my life now. So yeah, I think voluntary hardship is really useful now, but I don't think it's being used necessarily in the way to prepare for setbacks. I don't think modern people are using voluntary hardship so much for that. I think premeditation of adversity, which is sort of like the mental version of voluntary hardship, can be used for that by modern people. Imagine, rehearse things not going well, and you mentally prepare your wise responses in the face of that. But I think voluntary hardship now is being used. It's being used, I think, almost. It's a really weird thing, almost as a form of pleasure in a sort of way. Like, a lot of people are exercising these days, and if you look at Joe Rogan's podcast, the most popular podcast in the world, and he's constantly talking about saunas and ice baths and martial arts training and doing difficult things and discipline. I think the people are starting to really feel the pain of comfort, of aimlessness. When you don't have a need to survive, you're not in fight or flight. What then? It's not really a nice place to be. So yeah, a lot of people are drawn to things like voluntary hardship, but not for the Stoic reasons now. That's how I see it. But yeah, if from my perspective, if you aren't doing difficult things fairly regularly, then you're probably going to be at the cause. Sorry, you're probably going to be at the effect of life rather than at the cause. So the environment is going to be the thing that is reacting onto you, and you're going to be controlled by the environment. So advertising, the new social media apps, the latest trends, what other people think, all these externals, you are going to be at the effect of the external. Whereas the idea in Stoicism is that our internal, the thing that we can control, we are the cause in the world, in our lives. We are the main character. We are not bombarded and enslaved by the externals. And a lot of people, teenagers now, they do seem to be, from what I've seen, there's a show called Adolescence. Have you ever seen this? It's on Netflix.
And someone mentioned it to me recently.
Yeah.
I think saying it was very good, but I haven't seen it now.
Yeah, it's a story about male rage in a British teenage boy. The filming of it is amazing. It's shot in 4 continuous takes, and the acting and the performances are superb. But I recommend you watch that. When you see it, you think this is a kid that needs stoicism. He's very concerned what other people think of him, to the point that he wants to commit murder. And like that's the idea, and it's a sad state of affairs.
I suppose the environment now is cultivating more of that sense of being hyper aware of what other people think, because you have that immediate feedback of social media. If you're active on there and posting there regularly and people are reacting to it, then people are growing up sort of having that ingrained within their psyche, so to speak. So yeah, that's a very difficult thing to deal with.
Yeah, there's also there's an epidemic right now of nearsightedness. Children and adults are becoming a lot more nearsighted or short-sighted or myopic than ever before, because of the time that we're spending attached to screens. And one of the best antidotes to nearsightedness is being outside. The eye experts recommend being outside for at least 2 hours a day, and not spending so much time on things close up to you like screens or books at a young age. But how many children are doing that though? Spending multiple hours outside every day. Because at one point in the older generation, that was normal. And also it's there's a lot of blame being put onto kids and teenagers these days as well. Like, oh, they're not what they used to be. They have no respect. They have no discipline. But one thing I would say though is that, Alan, when you grew up, obviously I don't know the ins and outs of your upbringing, if your parents were together, separated, I don't know any of that. It doesn't really matter for this example. But when you grew up, whoever was looking after you, they weren't glued to a phone 7 hours a day. Nowadays, kids are being brought up, and the parent clearly prefers spending their attention on this other device in their pocket. And kids are being brought up in that environment from a very young age now. So it's kind of sad, and that would obviously have some kind of effect if you're being brought up and every time you look at your mother or your father, you see that they're not really listening to you. The thing that you're building is not as cool as the app they have on their phone. And they just can't wait to get back to it. And every time there's a difficult feeling, instead of dealing with it and working it through, they pick up their phone and start scrolling. That's difficult, for kids. That's going to have some effect. So yeah, there's lots going on at the moment that it's kind of a bit of a crazy experiment, and we don't quite know the long-term implications of it on like our health and psychology and our mind.
Yeah, it's quite frightening, really, that you could have maybe two parents and two kids in the same room, and all of them are on their device.
Yeah.
Completely oblivious to anyone else's presence. And yeah, I don't know what the solution to that is, but it's it doesn't seem to be a great outlook for the future. And as you say, going outside is one remedy, and I think that's probably a good remedy for a lot of things.
100%. But I would say, though, that you said you don't know what the remedy is, but this is actually where voluntary hardship ties in, because we talked about you have to customize it to where you're at. Putting your phone away in a drawer when your kids are around is absolutely a form of voluntary hardship if you're attached to your phone. That is absolutely a Stoic practice. And it's something that I do. It's something that I practice as well. There's an app that I use called Forest. It's like a study app. You plant a tree on your phone, and if you leave the Forest app, the tree dies. You can set a timer. So quite often I will put an hour timer on to plant a tree on my phone. And I'll even tell my son, hey, I'm planting a tree. That means we get 1 hour of PNP time, play no phone time. And I kind of use that as almost like a form of active meditation. And I only did it a few times before he started saying, Dad, can we do PNP time now? And like you could see that it was making a difference, because kids won't always tell you like in an articulated way, hey, I would like it if you put your phone down more and paid me more attention. They won't do that. It's up to us as the adults to do that. But that's a good example. Like going without screens is absolutely a form of voluntary hardship. And yeah, there's another app that I really like called OneSec. So what OneSec does is every time you open certain apps, it will bring up a screen, ask you to do a breathwork exercise, and then double check, are you sure you want to open this app? It kind of gets rid of that automatic picking up. So there are definitely solutions to that. But I do think managing screen time is just as an important form of voluntary hardship as going to the gym.
Epictetus said something like, if you want to break a bad habit, stop doing the thing, but you have to do something else instead. And it's something that I think Atomic Habits touches on too, where, you're trying to change your behavior. You can't just stop doing something and leave a space where it was. You have to replace it with something more constructive. So yeah, I try to do that too with my nephews, where instead of being on screens and things, I offer alternatives that are fun and capture their attention, and try to do something more constructive or active or engaging. And it sounds like you're probably doing something similar too.
Yeah, it's always a challenge, but it's always something to look at. And I think that one thing that I want people to take away from this talk as well is to do some brainstorming about where they are being comfortable in life in subtle ways. I think the subtle areas are the most important. An example of that is in my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practice, I go to the gym and I spar, and I'm doing something in training that people that are brand new to Jiu-Jitsu would say, oh, that's so difficult, that's so hard. It's not, it's a difficult sport. But I've got to a point where I've made it comfortable for me, so I spar with my good friends. I spar in a way that I don't exert myself too much. The best thing for me to do now would be to go with training partners more often that are higher belts that I don't know so well, that will make me work in different ways. Even though I can tell myself the story of, oh, I go training, that's good enough. Upon a closer inspection, maybe it's not good enough. Maybe there's improvements that can be made here. And then so the question is, how can I set a plan? What can I do? Not to change things overnight, but it could be something like, every time I go training, I need to have at least one round with someone I really don't want to spar with. And that's like a little way to ease into that. So, and the same for you with coaching. There may be a point in the future where you feel very comfortable in the coaching role. Maybe it will happen, maybe it won't, but I would imagine it will. And so at that point, the question then is not to tell yourself the story of, oh, I'm coaching, that's good enough. The next thing to do then is, oh, I'm going to try a new coaching technique in training. I'm going to try a new way of doing things that I am a little bit uncomfortable with. And I think that, that's how we grow.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. It's all about making it manageable, really, in the beginning and building from there. I think anyone listening to this can reflect on their own life and ways in which they may think they're, they are challenging themselves, but perhaps they've got comfortable with it, and maybe there's some other small thing they can do to take that a bit further, or some area that they haven't explored at all, which they've been putting off and which they really seen themselves moving into at some point, but just haven't quite found the courage to do so yet. What's the first and smallest step you could possibly take today or tomorrow to start that path?
Great. Yeah, that's a really good question to ask. I really like the virtue of self-kindness. It's very important. When I started learning about positive psychology, the first lesson I was taught was that no self-improvement technique will ever work unless you give yourself permission to be human as the fundamental rule. Because otherwise you're going to be doing all these different techniques from a place of desperation and self-hatred. I think that it's good to hold the two ideas together. The first idea is, I'm human and I'm completely allowed to have off days, and I'm completely allowed to quit, and I'm completely allowed to weasel out of things. If I'm not feeling training, I'm completely allowed to not do it, and I'm not going to judge myself for that. Meanwhile, I'm going to still show up tomorrow and try again. And having those two views, I think, is a really nice kind of balance. Aiming up, aiming for the best, aiming at your potential, while simultaneously giving yourself the same permission you'd give a loved one, a child. It's okay. You don't, you can have a day where you don't push it. That's okay. But we're not going to abandon the whole project. We're going to still keep showing up.
Yeah, I think Seneca said something similar. Okay, you may have made a mistake. See that you don't do it again, but for now, forgive yourself. You're only human.
Yeah, nicely put.
So did you have anything else you wanted to touch on with regards to hardship and challenge, John? Or would that be a good place for us to stop with that kind of practical advice that we were just discussing?
This is one of those topics that there's always more and more to talk about. So at a certain point, you kind of just have to stop. One other idea that I really do like, that I'll just throw into the mix, is this idea that it's sort of like a challenge to yourself. And this is more about obstacles, which is kind of linked to voluntary hardship as well. Is if something happens that is not ideal, instead of asking yourself the question, how can I manage this? How can I get through this? Which a lot of people would naturally ask, right? Like, say I twist my ankle. The question is, well, how can I manage this? How can I get through this without my life falling apart? Instead, I like to ask the question, how can I make this incident responsible for my greatness? How can I make this negative event not just something that I can deal with, but something that forces me into much greater heights, something that I will look back on and say that was invaluable. I would never want to change that. And it's just about asking a different question, instead, I think the quality of our questions will make a big impact on the quality of our life. So yeah, asking the question, not how can I cope? How can I deal with this? How can I manage this? But how can I allow this to be responsible for much better things? That is, that is something. And I think you did exactly that with the coaching, the football example. I'm getting a bit older now, I'm not at my genetic prime for football. But instead of how can I keep playing and get through it and not suck, it's the question then is how can I use this feeling of getting a bit older to propel me to become a coach and inspire others and make a big impact that way. And so it's now not a problem. It's actually really good. It's actually a really good thing. And by the sounds of it, you're enjoying the coaching too.
Yeah. I didn't think I would, but eventually I got to the point where I was, and as you say, it's an opportunity to try to be a positive role model and impart things that I've learned along the way, and hopefully help people not just on a sporting level, but hopefully a personal level too. Probably one of the shortest summaries of Stoicism I can think of is accept and adapt, and I think that's probably what you just summarized there. It's kind of welcoming every twist and turn, every fortune and misfortune.
Yeah.
Greeting that with a welcoming spirit,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I like that. Accept and adapt and overcome. The only other place I would kind of recommend to people is the challenge that I mentioned, that it's free. It's completely free. It's the Stoic Power Challenge. I can provide a link. It's the 7-day Stoic Power Challenge. I can provide a link to you, Alan, so you can provide that in the show notes of the episode.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll provide that link, and we'll provide the link to the article about Nero.
Oh yeah. Okay, cool.
That'll be great.
But yeah, no, this has been a really good conversation. I like the way that we kind of circled around lots of different ideas, then everything kind of pulled back into voluntary hardship. So that was really cool, and you asked some amazing questions.
Thanks, John. Appreciate your time. Really, really enjoyed talking to you as always, and I hope that listeners got some practical things they can take away and reflect on. So yeah, thanks again, John, and I'll speak to you soon.
Great. Thank you so much, Alan. Appreciate you.